My father didn't raise his voice when he said it. He didn't have to. The sentence landed with the quiet certainty of a door slamming shut. I was 19, standing in the foyer of the only house I had ever known. A duffel bag at my feet and a college acceptance letter folded in my jacket pocket. Not to law school like they wanted. Not to business school, to continue the legacy. I had chosen architecture, sustainable design, something they called impractical, idealistic, embarrassing. My mother stood behind him, arms folded tight across her chest as if she were bracing against a storm. "If you walk out over this," she said, "don't expect us to clean up the mess when you fail." Fail. That word followed me down the front steps, down the driveway, all the way to the curb, where I waited for a rideshare I could barely afford. I remember turning once, half expecting someone to call me back, to soften it, to say they didn't mean it. They didn't. The porch light flicked off before the car even arrived. That was the moment the power shifted, though I didn't know it yet. At 19, all I felt was the humiliation of being dismissed, of realizing that love, at least in my family, came with conditions. Study what we approve. Become what we respect. Reflect as properly didn't, and so I was cut loose. What they saw as rebellion was survival. What they called stubbornness was the first decision I ever made for myself. I left with 2 suitcases, a partial scholarship, and the kind of silence that echoes in your chest for years. They thought I'd come crawling back. They thought hunger would teach me obedience. They thought I'd need them more than they'd ever need. Me, they were wrong. Years later, the same people who told me not to come back needed something only I could give. And this time, I was the one standing at the door. The first year on my own felt less like independence and more like free fall. Tuition didn't care that I had walked away from my family. Rent didn't pause because I was proving a point. I worked 2 part-time jobs drafting assistant during the day. Restaurant server at night and learned very quickly how expensive pride could be. There were months when I chose between groceries and software subscriptions. Weeks when I pretended I wasn't exhausted because exhaustion felt too close to regret. No one was wiring money. No one was calling to check in. When my car broke down during sophomore year, I took the bus for 3 months in winter because I couldn't afford the repairs. I told classmates it was better for the environment. The truth was simpler. I had no safety net. If I fell, I hit the ground. Meanwhile, social media became a quiet form of torture. My older brother posted photos from networking galas with our parents. Champagne glasses raised beneath My sister interned at a firm my father's friend conveniently owned. Their captions used words like legacy and opportunity. Mine would have read overtime and overdraft fees, but something else was happening that no one saw. I was getting good. Architecture forced discipline into me. You don't bluff your way through structural load calculations. You don't charm a professor into overlooking flawed design. You either solve the problem or the building collapses on paper. I stayed late in studios long after others left. I learned software inside and out. I studied environmental codes until they felt instinctive. I made mistakes, miscalculated budgets, overdesigned concepts, underestimated material, cost sand each failure, stripped away ego, and replaced it with precision. By junior year, professors started asking for my input during critiques. By graduation, one of my sustainable housing proposals won a regional design award. The prize money covered 3 months of rent. It wasn't glamorous. It was survival. While my family expanded their social circles and their portfolios, I was building something quieter. Competence. Not the kind announced at banquets, but the kind earned in empty studios at 2 a.m. The kind that doesn't need applause to exist. I stopped checking their lives online. I stopped imagining apology speeches that never came. I built a small consulting practice focused on energy-efficient retrofits. 2 clients turned into 5. 5 turned into steady work. Slowly, carefully, brick by brick, I constructed a career without their name attached to it. I thought I'd close that chapter permanently. Then one Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in years. A call I never expected. I stared at the screen until it stopped vibrating. My father's name. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Pride is quieter at 27 than it is at 19, but it still exists. I answered anyway. Hello. A pause. The faint rustle of breath. It's Dad. Not how are you? Not. It's been a while. Just identification. Like we were strangers, confirming an appointment. We need to talk, he said. The word need hung there, heavy and unfamiliar. About what? It's a family matter. His tone was controlled, professional. Your mother and I would prefer to discuss it in person. I almost laughed at the phrasing, prefer. I agreed to meet them at their attorney's office downtown. Neutral ground. When I walked into the conference room 2 days later, the air felt staged polished oak table. Bottled water aligned perfectly. Legal pads already placed in front of each seat. My mother stood when I entered, but didn't move closer. You look well, she said carefully. I nodded. What's this about? My father slid a folder across the table. We're restructuring the estate. There are some properties and corporate shares that require your signature. My signature. The words took a second to settle. Years ago, when I left, my grandfather's will had quietly transferred a minority ownership stake in one of the families. Commercial developments into my name and oversight at the time, a technicality they assumed would eventually be consolidated. But I had never signed it over. I had kept it, not out of strategy, but stubborn independence. That minority stake had since grown. Appreciated. Acquired voting weight. Without my approval, they couldn't finalize the transfer of several high-value assets. Without my consent, a pending development deal would stall. The attorneys had confirmed it. They needed my co-signature to move forward. My father spoke as if this were routine. It's procedural. You'll sign. We'll consolidate holdings. And that's that. No apology. No acknowledgement of the years between us. Just expectation. They still thought I was the same person who walked out that door. I didn't touch the pen they'd placed in front of me. Instead, I opened the folder. The language was dense but familiar. Transfer of controlling interest. Consolidation of voting shares. Estate, liquidity, restructuring. Buried in the middle was the clause that mattered. My minority stake in the original Riverside development parcel, acquired through my grandfather's amended will and protected under the 1998 Founders Agreement. That agreement carried a silent partner provision. Any structural changes to core assets required unanimous consent from original equity holders or their heirs. At 19, when I'd stormed out of that house, no one thought that technicality would matter. It was supposed to be temporary. A placeholder. Something I'd eventually sign away once I came to my senses. I never did. And over time, that placeholder became leverage. The Riverside parcel had been used as collateral for a new mixed-use development, luxury retail, high-rise residential, tax abatements. Negotiated with the city, investors were already involved. Preliminary construction permits had been filed, but without full consolidation of ownership, the financing couldn't close. Without my signature, the deal stalled. Without the deal, projected revenue collapsed. Without projected revenue, their estate restructuring plan designed to minimize tax exposure and shield certain holdings from a pending zoning lawsuit fell apart. It wasn't just paperwork, it was timing, deadlines, capital commitments. A chain reaction. If I refused to sign, millions would freeze in escrow. If I delayed, the city could revoke preliminary approvals. If I contested the valuation, it could trigger a full audit of the company's holdings. They weren't asking out of sentiment. They were cornered. I closed the folder calmly. I'll need time to review this. My father frowned. It's straightforward. It's not, I replied evenly. There's a silent partner clause tied to the original charter. There are also fiduciary implications if the restructuring disproportionately benefits majority holders. My mother blinked. She hadn't expected jargon. I had spent years navigating municipal codes, environmental compliance, contractual loopholes. Complexity didn't intimidate me anymore. It interested me. After the meeting, I didn't call friends. I didn't vent. I called my attorney. We reviewed the founder's agreement line by line. We examined escrow conditions. We analyzed exposure from the zoning litigation. We discussed my rights as an equity holder and the long-term implications of consolidation. Emotion never entered the conversation. Only risk, only leverage, only choice. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to them. I was assessing them, and the longer I took, the more the balance shifted. They thought I'd sign immediately. We met again a week later, this time in the main boardroom of the company headquarters. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, the skyline my family had once described as theirs to shape. My father sat at the head of the table, my mother to his right. Two attorneys positioned like silent witnesses. They expected closure. I assume you've reviewed the documents, my father began,
sliding the same folder toward me as if the repetition alone would produce compliance.
I have, I said. And
he leaned back, confident, impatient. My mother tried a softer approach. We're still your family. There's no reason to drag this out. I placed my own folder on the table. There are reasons. My father's jaw tightened. Don't be petty. Petty. The word echoed strangely familiar. You owe us, he continued. We paid for your upbringing. Your schooling until you decided to walk away. This is a simple administrative matter. I opened my folder and spread out copies of the founder's agreement. The silent partner clause highlighted. A summary of projected losses if the development financing collapsed. A memo from my attorney outlining fiduciary risk. This isn't administrative, I said calmly. It's structural. If I sign, I relinquish not only voting power, but long-term equity tied to appreciating assets. I also absorb potential liability from the zoning dispute. My mother exhaled sharply. After everything we did, I looked at her then. Really looked. After everything you did, I repeated evenly. You told me not to bother coming back. The room went quiet. My father shifted in his chair. That was years ago. Yes, I agreed, and I took you at your word. Silence settled heavily between us. For a moment, something flickered across my mother's face. Maybe? My father didn't look away. You're overcomplicating this, he said finally.
This company survives because we make decisive moves. And it survives,
I replied, because contracts mean something. I wasn't angry.
I wasn't shaking. I wasn't trying to win an argument. I was stating facts. They had expected resentment or eagerness. They got analysis instead. My father's voice hardened. What exactly do you want? That was the first honest question he'd asked. I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence do the work. I didn't refuse, but I didn't sign either. That night, I sat alone in my apartment with the city humming faintly beyond the windows, the unsigned documents resting on my kitchen table. For years, I had imagined this kind of moment differently. In those old daydreams, I slammed doors. I delivered speeches. I made them feel small, the way they had made me feel small. Revenge is seductive when you've been dismissed. It promises symmetry. It promises balance. I thought about 19-year-old me standing on that driveway with a duffel bag and a fractured sense of worth.
I thought about holidays spent refreshing my inbox, hoping for some acknowledgement that never came.
I thought about how easily I could end their deal now, how one refusal could cost them more than they ever risked losing when they cut me loose. The temptation was real, but the more I sat with it, the clearer something else became. This wasn't about punishing them, it was about defining myself. If I refused purely out of spite, I would still be reacting to them, still orbiting their approval, just in reverse. Power that depends on someone else's downfall isn't power, it's attachment. So I made a different decision. I would sign conditionally. The restructuring would proceed only if my equity remained intact in specific appreciating assets. A governance clause would be added requiring unanimous consent for future consolidations. Transparency provisions would be written into the bylaws. And the zoning litigation risk would remain with majority holders. No apology required. No spectacle demanded, just terms. For the first time in my life, I wasn't asking to belong. I was choosing how I would participate. They accepted the terms. Not immediately, and not without tension. There were late-night calls between attorneys, revised drafts, clipped emails from my father that avoided anything resembling sentiment. But the math was undeniable. My conditions were measured, defensible, legally sound. In the end, they signed. The deal proceeded. Construction moved forward. Assets were restructured. Publicly, it looked seamless. Privately, something fundamental had shifted. My father spoke to me differently after that, carefully, almost cautiously. My mother's tone soft, though it carried an unfamiliar uncertainty. We weren't healed. We weren't suddenly close. But we were no longer pretending I was irrelevant. And the strangest part, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. The ache I'd carried since 19, the need to prove I mattered, had loosened its grip. Not because they changed, but because I did. They didn't need my signature, I needed that moment. If you've ever been told you were too much, too different, too impractical, or simply not enough, I want you to hear this clearly. Exile is not always rejection. Sometimes it's protection. Being told not to come back forced me to build a life that wasn't dependent on approval. It stripped away the illusion that love would eventually arrive if I just performed well enough. It hurt, but it also clarified. Power isn't revenge. Revenge keeps you emotionally tied to the people who wounded you. Real power is the ability to choose your response without needing them to change first. Boundaries aren't cruelty. They are architecture. They define where you end and someone else begins. And when you enforce them calmly, without rage, without theatrics, you don't become cold, you become sovereign. The reversal in my story wasn't about money or contracts. It was about authorship. I stopped auditioning for a role in someone else's narrative and started writing my own. If you've experienced family rejection, or if life has ever forced a role reversal you didn't see coming, share your story. I'm listening.